So this is a video just to help you guys review some of the big concepts from this unit. And I want you just to recall that when we started this unit, we talked about how political participation was the big thing and how people's political socialization is really what determines how they participate. So if you think about all those agents of socialization, especially the ones that happen very early on in our lives, our family, the people who raise us, educational institutions, learning how to share and be fair with other kids and sort of majority rules, things like that. And then also the concept of faith, in that religion gives us a lot of customs and traditions in our lives that really end up shaping how we interpret the events around us. And then as we grow older, we start to become more cognizant or aware of things like our race or our gender or our ethnic background or um, maybe how our specific religion approaches things in terms of other faiths. Where we live, our urban versus our suburban or rural environment, things like that, our education level, our income. Um, One of the things that's also important is that you guys really see the big ideas about how people interpret events. So go back to when we learned about the political spectrum and think about what the difference is between liberal versus conservative and how liberals tend to really focus on being more receptive to change and being able to modernize and change with the times. In the 1920s, people who were more liberal were called progressive. Um, Conservatism is, again, holding on to traditional, customary ways of life. You hear that old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that's what a lot of conservatives, like that's kind of the mantra of it. Now, to a person who wants to cling to the tradition, those things aren't broken in their society. But to other people who might want to modernize, they might think that the old viewpoints are a little bit outdated and broken and that they need to be updated. And who you are and how you've been raised and how you grow up really can impact how you interpret those events. In the United States, we have two dominant political parties that really try to embrace the liberal and conservative views. In our class, we talked about how political parties in the US, we have Democrats and Republicans, and then we have a few minor third parties. We also have this really strong two-party system, and the two-party system has its pros and cons, and you should be able to identify some of the weaknesses and some of the strengths of that. And in class one day, we even came up with a whole list of these off the top of our heads, and we just talked about them and put them on posters and put them up on the board, and we shared them. And you guys were right on par there. A two-party system is great because it makes things a little bit more simple, and these parties are really, really big and they embody a lot of ideas. But it's also kind of a negative aspect of our society too, because for people who don't feel embodied by those parties, they feel like they're not really part of the political system or that they can't really take part in voting. Also, with political parties, you have to really think about what their purpose is. They're they have many purposes. I mean, they bring people together. They help make things happen for individuals who want to participate politically. But the big deal that they want to do is they want to control government. So being in a political party is all about controlling government, winning elections. So political parties are the people who nominate candidates for office. So all of those primaries and caucuses that we talked about before school was out of session, like the New Hampshire primary and the Iowa caucus, those were all contests that were held by the political parties to nominate who they wanted to be for president. So right now, as it stands, a lot of states have pushed back their primaries because of distancing, including Rhode Island. Ours was scheduled to be April 28th, but it's now going to be in June. I hope that it will be in June. We'll see. But ultimately, political parties are really, really instrumental in elections, and we're going to talk about that more in the next unit. They want to control government. Interest groups are a little bit more diverse than political parties because there's a wide range of interest groups that are out there. Um, for example, some interest groups just focus on one issue. So some of you guys in class studied interest groups like the Sierra Club. They're only focused on the environment. Whereas somebody like The ACLU, the Americans for Civil Liberties Union, they're focused on many different issues that deal with civil liberties, anything from, unreasonable searches and seizures to freedom of speech issues to privacy. So they encompass everything under the umbrella topic of civil rights, but that topic in and of itself is very diverse. Also, they're more diverse because there's hundreds of them, maybe thousands of interest groups. Whereas political parties, you really only have two big choices in the United States. And sure, there are some smaller, minor parties, but they really have a difficult time breaking in to the political sphere because it's really hard to win an election with one of those third parties. The last thing is the mass media. The mass media you guys studied on your own for the most part with my guidance. And the mass media is really about that collective group of news outlets that try to convey the news from what's happening in the world to us, the people. The other interesting thing about the mass media is that if I just put the public here and elected officials, I'm going to put my marker is kind of too big. It's sort of like a two-way street. It's a two-way arrow there. Elected officials need the mass media because they can't reach us without it. They can't meet every single person personally. They can't do open air press conferences in every town in the United States. People can't have face-to-face contact with elected officials. So the media is really, really important because without the media, you wouldn't be able to understand what was happening in the world through exposure. Then we get into the whole concept of like, well, what does the mass media expose us to? They have a lot of power. So one of the things that you guys did with vocabulary, and then also hopefully through your I can statements, and then also through watching the news, is that you notice that the mass media functions as a gatekeeper. The gatekeeper function is really, really important because if you think about somebody standing at a gate citing who goes in and who goes out, that's a lot of power for the media. And then what we've seen over the last 30 years in particular is that from the business side of media, media has become more consolidated, meaning that fewer and fewer businesses out there run the media. You got to remember the media is a for-profit industry. So when you look at the media as a company like McDonald's or, Macy's or Target, they're just trying to make money. From a business perspective, people who work in journalism, it's a little bit on the other side of trying to uncover truth and bring that truth to the audience and really exercise their First Amendment right to free press. I think that in this modern day, there's clearly celebrity that's built in with being on television news, for example. And this goes back all the way to like the 1960s when you had somebody like Walter Cronkite who did the evening news, who every household in America knew. So there's a difference between sort of media being used as a source of information and then also media having an agenda. And when you learned about the media, you looked at something called the public agenda, and that was in the crash course video. And the public agenda is really what the public thinks is important simply because we see it covered on the news. So if I don't see something covered on the news, I might not even think it's an issue that's happening in the world, nor would I even think it's worth my time. I'm just realizing I've got some stars here, and I just want to go back to the interest groups. I kind of overlooked what their big purpose is. So the purpose of an interest group, rather than hold elected office like a political party, is to have legislation and public policy passed that really helps that interest group's purpose. All of them have a mission. And when you guys were in class one day, we did an exploration and you were in partners or in threes and you got to choose an interest group and you just studied what they were about. You looked at what their mission statement was and you looked at what their work in legislative activity had been and all of that stuff. Interest groups are really trying to just make laws that either help and support their interests, or sometimes interest groups try to stop the progression of other people's interests. So, for example, you might have a pro-life group that is obviously in opposition to abortion rights. If there's an important bill that's coming up in a state house or in the federal Congress where abortion rights might be expanded, you might see a pro-life interest group really try to lobby various legislators to not vote in favor of that bill. So remember the concept of lobbying, and lobbying can be as simple as you personally in Barrington, Rhode Island, writing an email to Sheldon Whitehouse, your senator, or it could be as high level and as expensive as a professional lobbyist that's hired by, let's say, that pro-life group that is actually holding a meeting with a senator and saying, I can help you not only vote against this bill, but to write a new bill that would limit reproductive rights. So sometimes interest groups are really, really important because they bring a level of expertise to bill writing that the legislators don't have. A senator and a rep doesn't have the expertise in, for example, scientific research. So when a bill comes up about scientific, a scientific stats, pardon me, like for example, for pollution, a representative doesn't know what the appropriate levels of, let's say, carbon are for the air. So we need someone with expertise. The biggest thing that I think that you also need to think about is how these three groups interact with one another. So if you think about how, in order to get their legislation passed, interest groups need to have people in elected office. So look at all the ways that interest groups can help people win elected office. They can donate to their campaigns. They can run television ads for them. They can campaign for them on social media. They can go door to door. They can send out flyers in the mail. They can do so many things to help political parties. The other thing that political parties need is the political parties, in order to win office, they need support from special interest groups. And you'll hear about people running for office that say, oh, I refuse to take money from special interests. And there are people out there that absolutely do not take money from these interest groups for donations or accept any sort of free advertising from them. That's rare. Many people in American politics who are elected into office that run underneath the Democratic or Republican Party do, in fact, get endorsed by these groups. They get promoted by these groups. They get supported financially by these groups. And that these interest groups also can function, again, in the opposite direction. If they don't want somebody to win a nomination, or if they don't want somebody to win that office, like the nomination would be Democrats running against Democrats, whereas the elected to office is typically a Democrat running versus a Republican. Interest groups can also run ads against people. They can run smear campaigns. And in fact, in 2004, a really powerful campaign that was against who would become the Democratic nominee for president, John Kerry, was an ad with former colleagues of him in the United States military that fought with him in Vietnam, sort of smearing his reputation as a soldier. And they were really powerful political ads, and they were run by a group called the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. And they were a temporary interest group that was established during the election just to run ads against John Kerry, and they weren't affiliated with any particular candidate. And you'll see ads that are run, and by law, they have to say at the end who is financing the ad, and some of them are by candidates. You'll hear things like, I'm Gina Raimondo and I endorse this message. But then there's other ones that say things like, this ad was paid for by Rhode Islanders for a better future. Those are interest groups. In order to have those ads, interest groups need the media, and the media needs interest groups. Without interest groups and political ads, the mass media would be out a lot of money. Media outlets sell all of those spots to politicians, and when it comes to the general election period for a presidential election or a really big year with a midterm election, you have a giant state like California, and you only have one Senate seat up for election that year, the media is super duper important to both political parties and to interest groups. Without the media, elected officials wouldn't be able to reach us. Without elected officials, the mass media would lack a lot of fuel for their news broadcasts. So really think about how not only what these groups do on their own, but how they help and support each other's goals. And that's some of the info that you guys can use going over your ICANN statements.